Title: The Monster of Florence Netflix Review. The true crime story they didn't show you. The shadow in the vineyards. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, like, and drop your theories in the comments, because what you're about to hear is darker than any Netflix script. The hills of Tuscany look like something out of a postcard: golden fields, quiet olive groves, and vineyards rolling toward the horizon. But beneath that calm beauty lies one of the most disturbing criminal mysteries Europe has ever known. A case so twisted and contested that even today, decades later, no one agrees on who the real killer was, or whether he was ever caught at all. They call him the Monster of Florence. And if you've seen the Netflix show, you've only scratched the surface. Our story begins on a warm summer night in 1982, just outside Florence. A couple had driven into the countryside for privacy, a common thing among young lovers back then. The area they chose was quiet, remote, and nearly invisible in the darkness. A place lovers knew, and someone else knew too. When dawn came, a farmer walking his fields noticed something strange. A car, windows fogged, parked where it shouldn't be. He approached slowly, expecting maybe teenagers sleeping off a long night. But as he got closer, his chest tightened. The doors were slightly open. There was no movement. No sound. Inside the car, the young couple lay brutally murdered. The details that followed would shock the region. The precision, the brutality, the disturbingly personal nature of the injuries. This wasn't just murder. It was a message. An act performed with ritual-like intention. And it wasn't the first time. Italian police, already under pressure from recent scandals and public distrust, formed a special investigative task force. They believed the killer stalked lovers' lanes, hunting couples in parked cars. Authorities linked the murders to previous unsolved killings stretching back years. The same method. The same signature. That's when the press gave him a name that would haunt Italy forever. Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. Detectives combed the crime scene, but every clue unraveled into confusion. A cigarette butt, but with no matching DNA on file. Tire tracks, but from a common brand used all across Italy. A witness claimed to have seen a strange man watching from the trees, but his description changed every time he told it. Nothing fit tightly enough to convict, but everything pointed to someone who knew the region extremely well. Someone patient. Someone who watched. And someone who knew how to disappear. One of the lead investigators, Inspector Lorenzo Bianchi, was the kind of man who believed that every killer leaves a footprint, if not physical then emotional. His colleagues called him obsessive. He studied crime scene photos until his eyes blurred, pacing his apartment late into the night. He visited the families of the victims, listened to their grief, and promised answers he wasn't sure he could deliver. He became convinced the monster wasn't a drifter or an outsider. The killer, he believed, was from Florence. Someone who blended into daily life, smiling at neighbors, drinking espresso in the morning, and hunting human beings at night. But the deeper the investigation went, the stranger things became. Rumors spread through the countryside. Whispers of a secret group, a possible ritualistic motive, even claims that someone high in power might be involved. Some said the investigation wasn't failing, it was being blocked. Meanwhile, the killings continued. Each murder scene felt like déjà vu, the same eerie stillness, the same surgical precision. The killer never left a clear pattern of escape, yet always arrived and vanished without being seen. Some officers believed the monster surveilled police radios. Others thought he had an accomplice. No one agreed on anything anymore. Fear settled over Florence like a cold fog. Couples stopped going out at night. Lovers' lanes were abandoned. The vineyards, once symbols of romantic escape, became shadows of intimidation. Parents warned their children. Old men locked their doors. The countryside grew quiet, not peaceful quiet but watchful quiet. The kind that listens for footsteps. But the case took its darkest turn when police arrested a local man named Pietro Pacciani, a rough-mannered farmer with a violent past. The media latched onto him eagerly. He looked like a killer. He had a criminal record. And the public desperately wanted someone to blame. Pacciani was tried, convicted, and declared the monster. But something was wrong. Almost immediately, the evidence began to fall apart. Witness statements contradicted. Key material went missing. A prosecutor suddenly resigned. Several detectives publicly disagreed with each other. And whisper by whisper, a theory emerged. What if Pacciani wasn't the monster at all? What if he was just a convenient face, a scapegoat offered to calm a terrified nation? Inspector Bianchi didn't believe Pacciani was guilty. The killings in his mind were too controlled, too methodical. Pacciani lacked the psychological profile, the skill, the patience. But his objections were ignored, and soon the monster case became less of an investigation and more of a battlefield. Police versus police, politicians versus journalists, truth versus appearances. Then came the turning point. One night, while reviewing case files alone, Bianchi noticed something hidden in plain sight. A photograph taken at the 1982 crime scene. In the background, barely visible through trees, was a second car. Unreported. Unidentified. It had been dismissed as possibly a farmer's vehicle, but the angle and distance were wrong. Someone else had been there that night. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. With his heart pounding, Bianchi tracked down the original negatives. He enlarged them carefully. What he found wasn't clear enough to identify a license plate, but it was clear enough to see that the car's windows were open, as if someone had been sitting, watching, waiting. But that wasn't the part that broke the case open. It was what was found inside the photo archive envelope, a sealed note and signed with only 8 chilling words. "You are looking in the wrong direction, Inspector." That note wasn't logged. It wasn't part of any official evidence record. Someone had slipped it inside. Someone who had access. Someone close. Someone inside the investigation. And when Bianchi checked the storage logs for who handled the archives the week that photo was filed, only one name appeared. A name he recognized. A name that should have been impossible. His own partner. The investigator in the mirror. Inspector Lorenzo Bianchi sat alone in his car long after midnight, the interior drenched in a half-light that came from a flickering street lamp just outside police headquarters. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his fingers trembled. Not from fear, at least not the kind he could name. It was something deeper. Something like disbelief hollowing him from the inside out. The photo archive log did not lie. The only recorded person who had handled the envelope containing that crime scene photograph, and the chilling handwritten note, was Inspector Marco Venturi, his partner of nearly 8 years. The man who had been with him on the first night the monster's case reopened. The man who shared coffee with him at dawn, who stood beside him through interrogations, who held him back when rage threatened to take over in front of grieving families. Marco, the one person he trusted. The one person he confided in about the small, dark fears that came with working homicide for too long. Lorenzo forced himself to breathe. Slowly. Methodically. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the log was wrong. Maybe the clerk made a mistake. Maybe the note came from someone else. Maybe. But denial collapsed under the weight of memory. Marco had been at every crime scene sooner than others. Marco often arrived before the forensic teams. Marco was the one who suggested lines of inquiry that led nowhere. Marco was the one who insisted that Pietro Pacciani be seen as the likely killer, even when evidence didn't fit. And Marco was the one who told Lorenzo to let it go when he began digging too deeply. Lorenzo closed his eyes. He could hear Marco's voice perfectly. Calm. Familiar. Warm. You're working yourself into a labyrinth, Lorenzo. Not every mystery has a minotaur. But this one did. And Lorenzo now had to face the possibility that it was standing right beside him the entire time. The next morning, Lorenzo walked into the station as if nothing had changed. He greeted officers, signed papers, drank his espresso. But inside, every muscle in his body felt coiled like a tripwire. He glanced toward Marco's desk, empty as usual in the early hours. Marco was never in before 9:30. Said mornings were for normal people, not detectives. Lorenzo sat. He had to move carefully, very carefully. If Marco was involved, then even a hint of suspicion could be enough to put him on alert. And if Marco was the monster, he was extremely dangerous. Lorenzo began retracing every detail. Every conversation. Every decision. Marco always had suggestions that seemed logical at first but led to dead ends. He always knew which witnesses were not worth bothering. He always had a way of calming public pressure, of shifting blame. He was good at being right just slightly too often. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. But something else disturbed him more than all of that. If Marco was involved, then he wasn't working alone. The murders required planning, surveillance, knowledge of lovers' hiding places, knowledge of police patrol patterns, knowledge of forensic response times. This wasn't the work of a lone predator. It was the work of someone who understood systems. Maybe multiple someones. That afternoon, Lorenzo visited a retired journalist named Claudia Rana, who had covered the murders relentlessly in the early years. Her reporting was sharp, aggressive, and often criticized for pushing the possibility that the monster case was being mishandled or misdirected. She had quit journalism abruptly and retreated to a quiet cottage near the Arno River. When Lorenzo arrived, she looked older than he remembered, her face lined not just with age but with something heavier, disappointment maybe, or knowledge that never let her rest. "You're not here for a social call?" she said as she poured him coffee. "No," Lorenzo replied. "You were right about Pacciani." Claudia didn't react. She had spent years being right in the wrong ways. "You found something," she said instead. Lorenzo nodded. "A name." She didn't flinch. That meant she wasn't surprised. "Say it," she said. "Marco Venturi." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then she spoke. "Not him alone. Never him alone." Lorenzo leaned forward. "What do you know?" Claudia exhaled slowly. Her voice lowered. "There were always rumors of a circle, men in high places. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen. Men who believed they were above consequence. Men who shared a fascination with control. Some believed killing lovers was a symbolic act, a punishment of desire. Others said it was something darker, ritualistic, a test of loyalty, power proven through cowardice." She looked directly into his eyes. "And some of those men had access to police files, to evidence rooms, to the investigation itself." Lorenzo felt the floor shift under him. He had always looked outward for the monster. But the darkness was inside the institution. Inside the investigation. Maybe inside the very room where evidence had been discussed, decisions made, victims forgotten. "Pacciani wasn't a scapegoat," Claudia continued. "He was a shield. Something thrown to the public to make them look away from the real danger. The men who were watching from the shadows while the world stared at the stage." Lorenzo's voice cracked slightly. "Marco is one of them?" Claudia didn't answer immediately. "He introduced you to the case, didn't he?" Lorenzo froze. He had never noticed that detail. Marco had been the one to bring him into the monster task force. He had encouraged him. He had shaped how he saw the investigation. He wasn't just a partner. He was a guide. And guides choose the path. Very carefully. When Lorenzo returned to Florence, the day had turned stormy. Wind slammed shutters. Street vendors scrambled to protect their stands. Tourists rushed for shelter. The city felt restless, like it remembered something dark. Lorenzo walked into the station again, and this time Marco was already there. Leaning on Lorenzo's desk. Waiting. His smile was friendly. Too friendly. "You look tired," Marco said. "Long night." Lorenzo forced a nod. "Just thinking." Marco chuckled softly. "You think too much. It'll kill you someday." His eyes didn't match his smile. Not anymore. Lorenzo now saw something else in them. Calculation. Awareness. Study. Marco already knew. He knew Lorenzo knew. And the atmosphere between them shifted. A fragile membrane stretched thin enough to snap at a breath. Marco straightened and placed a file on the desk. "A new lead came in," he said casually. "We should check it out together. Just the two of us." The invitation felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Of course," Lorenzo replied. His voice was steady. His heartbeat was not. As Marco walked away, Lorenzo slowly opened the file left on his desk. Inside was only one item. A photograph. A lover's lane outside Florence. Taken at sunset. Empty. Waiting. And the caption written beneath it in Marco's handwriting made Lorenzo's blood run cold. "We return to where it began. The vineyard at dusk." The road leading out of Florence twisted through ancient cypress trees, their black silhouettes clawing at the late evening sky. The sun was sinking into the horizon, red, heavy, slow, the kind of sky painters travel the world to capture. But tonight it didn't look beautiful. Tonight it looked like a warning. Inspector Lorenzo Bianchi gripped the steering wheel as his car followed the dusty country road. Ahead of him, Marco Venturi's vehicle moved steadily, never too fast, never too slow, as if Marco knew exactly how long he wanted this drive to last. The further they drove, the quieter the world became. No city sounds. No passing cars. Just the hum of engines and the distant chirp of cicadas. They were returning to Lover's Lane. To the place where it had begun. To the fields where so many lives had ended. But this time the hunters weren't hidden. They were side by side. The vineyard was eerily unchanged. Rows of grapevines stood like soldiers in tight formation, the ground soft and uneven beneath them. The same old oak tree still cast its wide shadow across the clearing. The space was peaceful, too peaceful. Marco parked his car and stepped out. Lorenzo followed, keeping his movements steady, controlled. The sky was almost dark now, only a sliver of dying light remained. Marco stood near the center of the clearing, his hands in his coat pockets, as if he were simply admiring the countryside. You brought your gun? Marco asked, his voice calm. You told me it was an active lead, Lorenzo answered. Marco nodded once. Good. Would have been awkward otherwise. There was no smile on his face now. No warmth. Just a quiet neutrality, the expression of a man who wasn't pretending anymore. For the first time Marco spoke without masks. You were always going to find it, he said. Eventually. You're stubborn. You dig where others smooth the soil. Lorenzo didn't respond. He was watching Marco's hands. His breathing. His stance. Marco continued. This case, it was never about finding a killer. It was about preserving a story. A narrative that made sense to the public. The monster was not a man. He was a myth. A myth crafted to shield the truth. And the truth is what? Lorenzo asked. Marco gestured to the vineyard. That there were men who believed love was corruption. Who believed intimacy was weakness. Men who felt they were chosen to cleanse the world of that weakness. You're talking about the so-called circle, Lorenzo said. The group Claudia described. Marco gave a small, almost disappointed sigh. Claudia talks too much. That's why they took her voice from her. Lorenzo froze. What do you mean took? Marco looked at him with faint irritation. The kind a teacher would give a student who was slow to understand. You were at her house, Lorenzo. Didn't you feel it? That sadness? She knows too much. And soon she'll stop being able to speak at all. These things happen quietly so the world stays calm. Lorenzo felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just murder. It was control. Marco looked around the clearing, breathing in the evening air like it belonged to him. We didn't hunt lovers, he said. We hunted desire. The act. The moment people believed they were safe from consequence. That is what needed to be destroyed. Lorenzo shook his head. You're not cleansing anything. You're killing people. Innocent people. Marco's eyes softened, with something like pity. No one is innocent, Lorenzo. We all hide something. You hide your fear. Your doubt. Your guilt. You're no different from them. You simply wear a badge to excuse it. Lorenzo felt the weight of the gun at his side. The metal felt heavier than usual. But Marco hadn't drawn his weapon. Not yet. He wasn't afraid. He was certain. Why me? Lorenzo asked quietly. Why bring me into this? Marco stepped closer, not threatening but intimate. You needed a purpose, he said. And I needed someone intelligent beside me. Someone who could understand the pattern. Someone who wouldn't crumble under the sight of blood and grief. Someone strong enough to see the world clearly. The wind moved softly through the vines. Marco's voice lowered. You were supposed to join us. Lorenzo stared at him, and for the first time truly saw him. Not as a colleague. Not as a friend. But as a believer. A zealot dressed in plain clothes. A monster with a human smile. Marco took one slow step back, removing his hands from his pockets. Not in a draw but in surrender. Now it comes to choice, he said. You can shoot me. Tell the world you killed the Monster of Florence. They'll give you medals. Statues. Streets named after you. He paused. Or, you can walk away. You can pretend you never saw this. You can survive. Lorenzo hesitated. Then Marco said 6 words that froze the night. We are not done killing yet. The gunshot echoed across the vineyard. A sharp, thunderous crack that startled birds from the trees and sent them scattering into the dark. Marco fell. But his expression was not fear. It was sadness. As he lay bleeding, he looked up at Lorenzo, eyes clear, steady. You think this ends with me? He whispered. You have no idea how many there are. Lorenzo stood frozen. The world was silent except for Marco's weakening breaths. Then headlights appeared. A second car. Then another. And another. 3 vehicles total, rolling silently into the clearing. Doors opened. Figures stepped out. Men in suits. Calm. Expressionless. Watching. Not attacking. Just watching. One of them, tall, silver-haired, wearing a tailored coat, walked forward. He didn't look at Marco's body. He looked at Lorenzo. His voice was steady. Cold. This chapter of the story ends here. You will go back to Florence. You will say Marco acted alone. You will close the case. And you will never return here. Lorenzo didn't move. Didn't speak. The man tilted his head. You survived tonight. That was a gift. Don't waste it. Lorenzo slowly lowered his gun. He understood. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was an institution. He walked back to his car. He didn't look back. Not once. Because he knew if he did, he might never be allowed to leave. Weeks later, the newspapers ran the headline. The Monster of Florence identified and killed. Case closed. Marco Venturi was labeled a lone madman. A tragic fall from grace. A neat ending. A story everyone could accept. But Florence remembered. And Lorenzo remembered. And one night, months later, as he walked home past the Arno River, a woman brushed past him. She never looked at him. Never paused. But she whispered, "We are still watching." Lorenzo did not turn. Because the monster had never been one man. The monster was the silence. And the silence was everywhere. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss it.